These are 10 different books that have been published in 2019, and I'm going to ask you to look at them for a moment and see what catches your eye. Half of them are from the horror genre, and just based on the covers, which ones do you think they are? The Familiars is a horror novel. It deals with a woman whose midwife may or may not be a witch. While You Sleep is a Scottish ghost horror story. City of Girls is a love story set in the 1940s. Black Leopard, Red Wolf is a fantasy novel drawing from African myths and history. Mostly Dead Things follows a woman dealing with her father's suicide while running a taxidermy shop. Rough Magic is a memoir about a horse race in East Asia. Growing Things is the newest horror work from Paul Tremblay. Trust Exercise is a 1980s New York love story. Missing Person is another horror novel that places us with a group of detectives hunting a killer. And finally, Wilder Girls is a young adult horror novel that pits a group of young girls on an island against the mysterious Tox. But you don't really know that's true, do you? I mean, I could be lying to you, after all. I'm not, but I could be. And you wouldn't really be able to tell if I was, because most of these covers could be paired with most of these stories, and they would still, more or less, fit. Marketing with book covers is supposed to communicate a lot of information to the potential reader in under a second. But what do all of these covers really convey to you about the potential that these stories hold? In the past 2 decades, publishing has become more and more reliant on graphic design, with colorful, bold text overlays as opposed to fully painted illustrations, when it comes to the covers of all types of books. And I'm not against that at all. In fact, as a book collector, I love how pretty the average book has become. And at no point in this video am I trying to knock the talented people who design books. I only have respect for them, and I really think, on average, books today look a lot better than they ever have. But I think in all of this, a problem has come about, where in a lot of these cases, you can't even tell what genre a book is supposed to be when you look at it. Most of the time, I have to scan the cover for small words like haunting, thrilling, dark, shocking, or something else like that, within quotation marks on the cover, before I can even begin to determine if something is a work of horror or not. You may walk the aisles of Barnes & Noble or your local library and see covers on books like these, and literally have no idea as to what might even happen in them. And when everybody is following the same trends and designs at the same time, it makes all the shelves feel like an unending sea of graphic pattern sameness, with bold pastel-colored fonts that may or may not feature a Renaissance painting in the background. Or at least that's how I feel. And to me, I think there is an issue going on here within publishing that should be addressed, in that there isn't a great deal that separates the horror books from the others, at least on the surface, that is. From a young age, I stumbled into collecting horror books. I didn't mean to, it was just sort of something that happened to me. I started in elementary school, reading Goosebumps, Animorphs, The House with a Clock in Its Walls, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and Bunnicula. I don't think it was a conscious decision on my part. I just gravitated to what interested me most, as all kids do. And the interesting covers were what sparked my young mind, possibly as a side effect from my early comic book collecting. But from there, I moved on to things like Christopher Pike books, Tales from the Crypt reprints, Creepshow, Beware, The Nightmare Hour. And from there again onto authors like Stephen King, H.P. Lovecraft, Clive Barker, and Scott Smith. So it's not something that I really did, but more so something that happened to me, and has always been there for me from a really young age. And so I find myself today, with more horror novels on my shelf than I could ever possibly read. I have books ranging from the 30s, 40s, and 50s all the way up to current day. Ghost stories, murder mysteries, vampires, werewolves, creepy kids, doctors, cults, and evil men who draw spooky things that come alive. But the books that I like the most, and have always liked the most, are the ones that are so undeniably horror, that the very act of holding them in your hands is fun and enjoyable. The books that harken in my mind to the very things that made me fall in love with horror to begin with. The art that was being put on horror books in the 70s and 80s and 90s was fresh, it was visceral and unnerving, and it sometimes even perverse. Artists like Jill Bauman, Oliver Frey, Lisa Falkenstern, and Tom Hallman, and others use their skills and abilities to bring the flesh of monsters to life in order to sell millions of books, and I think that's pretty cool. And at least for me, I would much rather have a book that had art in this style on the cover than just a graphic print in today's style. Because as time has gone on, I think horror novels have lost a lot of what made them appealing to a younger me. To look at this trend and see how it has played out for the horror genre, I think that it would be best to look at the works of Stephen King as an example, because he has a great number of classics that have been republished multiple times by different publishing houses across different decades. And by looking at those covers, we can see the thought process of design for horror books and how it has changed in the past 30 years. Linda Fenimore's painting for the 1983 release of Pet Sematary contributes to one of the best horror novel covers of all time. Just the look of it is classic, from the color choices to the composition of the figures, and the typeset that they used over top her work. Everything about it to me is near perfect. And here are a series of reprints from the next few decades, all of which, to me, don't hold a candle to the class that the Fenimore cover has. Because after publishing left fully painted covers behind, a lot of horror novels started to either look cheaply made or just like everything else that wasn't horror on the shelf, with very few titles keeping to that old classic aesthetic. Really, the only reprint of Pet Sematary that I have seen that does it for me, that has a different cover from the original, is the late 80s, early 90s British edition shown here. And it too features a very classic painted cover done here by Gary Grace, who also did covers for the British versions of It and The Long Walk. And this is the case for all of Stephen King's early work that has since been republished over and over again, slowly digging a pit straight into graphic design hell, with few covers actually matching the tone of the story while still being visually pleasing. And again, it's not that I think that most of these books are ugly at all. In fact, the newest Scribner run of his titles are really quite nicely designed, and have good quality paper for both the inside and for the cover. I just don't think that they really properly display the spirit that these horror novels had, besides the fact that King's name is listed on top of them. Because, in all honesty, if you took someone who had never heard of Stephen King before, and asked them to guess what genre these books were just from looking at them, from roughly 5 feet away or so, I would wager that you would get all kinds of answers, some right, some wrong. When you look at the early printings of King's work, it is really clear what these books are, and most of these images were so impactful that they became representations of a certain time in American culture. No one is going to look at Stephen Stroud's covers for Cujo or Firestarter, or Rob Wood's work on Needful Things, Nightmares and Dreamscapes, or 4 Past Midnight, and wonder what genre these books are, because the covers are so classy and distinctive and properly showcase a preview of what the book might bring to you with its text. Some of the largest victims of this trend to me are the most pulpy of novels, that really don't work with modern style tastes. Take Sean Costello's The Cartoonist, for instance. It's not an amazing book, but it's a fun book and I love it. And nobody is going to be fooled into thinking that this is anything other than what it looks like. And that's a good thing. Because this is literally a camp story about a man who makes evil drawings. And this cover says that. And this is the cover that made me buy and want to read this book. But here are the different covers that have been on this book in the past few decades. Surprisingly, The Cartoonist has been reprinted multiple times, and is currently still in print. That isn't the case with most of these crazy horror titles from this time, and most of them drift off into forgotten obscurity. But I'm glad this one has been published multiple times because I can show you how these different covers reflect more modern design sensibilities, and more or less try to make this book look like something that it isn't. These covers seem almost ashamed of what the book is really about, and as a result they aren't appealing to me at all, because the original cover is unabashedly proud to be displayed on a book about a man with magic pencils. And that's why it's fun. For me, pulp genre fiction has become afraid to say what it actually is, and I think that's really sad. Because the enjoyment of a lot of these titles was it saying flat out that it understands that the concepts that it's playing with are insane, but that it still wants to take you on a fun and crazy adventure with that in mind. And I understand that this is entirely subjective, and that there are probably some people who much prefer the newer versions and styles as opposed to the older ones on a lot of these books, but there's just something intangible about the original art for me that I can't put into words, where in most cases the image and text have been molded together into one work of art, and new visuals being placed on these old texts feels too clean and indistinct and modern. And even with a lot of new horror novels that are being published today, I feel a bit melancholy when I look at them, because they just aren't as fun to look at as their ancestors were. And just to be clear, I also understand that this is not the case with all new horror novels. Grand sweeping statements never cover everything entirely accurately, and there will always be outliers in any given scenario. And these here are just a handful of the horror books that have been published in recent years that have truly great covers on them. But generally, I see this as a trend that is affecting enough of newly published horror books to be an issue, where they either look like they aren't horror, or they are just trying to hide how pulpy the story really is, or they just look horrible and cheap in a self-published kind of way, with very few titles staying true to the notions of the genre that make shopping for these kinds of books fun as a consumer. It's a big aspect of my appreciation for what Valancourt Books is doing at the moment, because I think they are currently making a big statement on how horror should be treated and published. I've mentioned this before in an earlier video, but in 2017, Grady Hendrix released his collection titled Paperbacks from Hell, that showcased and detailed the timeline of horror publishing. And since his title became a major success, Valancourt Books has partnered with Hendrix to cultivate a small library of reprinted titles that are mentioned in his book, but they are changing almost nothing about their original state while reprinting them, leaving the same covers and designs when possible, only adding a Paperbacks from Hell branded logo in the top right corner of each novel that they produce, along with an introduction by Hendrix. And the way I see it, it's essentially the book version of a digital remastering of an old movie, almost like the Criterion Collection except for horror books and not films. They are presenting these old texts in the most pure way that they can, and I think that this is the idea that should be used within horror publishing going forwards. And they aren't doing that just for the Paperbacks from Hell titles either, because Valancourt, in their own words, specializes in the rediscovery of rare, neglected, and out-of-print fiction. They have a large library of older great horror books that they have given a fresh coat of paint, and the covers and presentation for most of their products live up to the classic design standards of the genre, with a modern, tasteful twist added to it. They, to me, seem to be the modern response to the design of these older books, where they both at the same time feel old and new, and I really respect the style that they are forging on a lot of these new editions. From everything that I have seen, they are leading the path in horror design, and are doing it better than just about anyone else at the moment, which is especially impressive for a company run by only 2 people. And that isn't a sponsored statement, even if it sounds like one. They haven't given me any money to say any of this. I just truly appreciate what they are doing within genre publishing, and they are some of the only people who are still making books that look and feel like the kind that I grew up with, and I think that people are beginning to notice. I have always felt at home in libraries and bookstores. It's a comfortable space for me. But more and more as time goes by, I find myself seeking out used bookstores as opposed to larger chains. And I think that this is the main reason for that change within me. I've become disinterested with the larger chains with new books, because a lot of the new genre books have lost their charm for me, and I don't have as much fun looking and hunting for them. They don't give me that same feeling of discovering an unknown treasure anymore. And for the most part, I only find myself reading new horror only after buzz about it has spread online, and I kind of hate that. Before I had ever even heard of Grady Hendrix or Paperbacks from Hell, I was in a bookstore in 2017 and saw his novel My Best Friend's Exorcism on the shelf near the front, and I bought it immediately, just based on how fun the cover was, and I never do that anymore, but I want to. On their blog, Valancourt says that Amazon sales make up over 90% of their book purchases. I have not yet noticed a copy of one of their books in person in any bookstore, including specialty shops, and I think that's kind of sad, because they are just one of many publishers like Altus Press and Penguin Classics that are still making books that feel the way that books once felt, that are trying to make a difference in the way that horror reads in your hands. I love to fall into books at night, right before bed, but I always find myself reading things that were created years before I was even born, and all I would like is to be able to start placing new books on my nightstand that make me as comfortable as those old ones do.